right. We're happy to have you with us today if you're here live or if you will be watching this recording later. And we are continuing today in our series on the Ten Commandments. And today we are studying the fifth commandment. I don't know if I'll teach on it again. I might divide this sermon up and talk about another part of it, but today I won't. I'll just talk about one aspect of this commandment, the fifth commandment, which is to honor your father and your mother. Now, many people find it interesting to read about the childhoods of famous people, and that's probably one of the reasons why, probably the main reason why, that many people came up with fanciful, crazy, made-up stories about the childhood of Jesus Christ. It wasn't even 100 years after, or maybe 150 years or so after the church started, and you had these bogus stories about Jesus' childhood. There's absolutely no historical basis for any of those stories except what we read in Matthew and what we read in Luke. And Matthew just talks about his birth, and it does say that his parents took him to Egypt, and that's all. In Luke, we read a little bit more, but we only read of really one other incident, and that's an incident that occurred in the life of Jesus when he was 12 years old. He went to the Passover in Jerusalem with his parents, and then he got into a conversation with some of the religious leaders. His parents left him behind, you recall, and that's the only time we read about anything in his childhood clear up to the age of 30. Now that ought to tell us something. And I think what that tells us is that God, if he's not going to really tell you anything about his childhood, doesn't want you to know anything else about his childhood except this one thing. And what he tells you about his childhood must be very important. And the thing that we learn about that childhood and that incident is that he went back to Nazareth with his parents and he was obedient to them. So I think God is highlighting that, don't you? That Jesus, as a child, was obedient to his parents. And this is remarkable since we know that Jesus was the creator of the universe. And yet, as a child, when he humbled himself and became a man, he was obedient to his own parents. And so the example of our Lord is really fitting as an introduction to our study of the fifth commandment when we're talking about honor your father and your mother. And the base command in this is to honor your father and your mother. Now, I've quoted here on the screen from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. And what I have underlined there, you can see, is what Paul is quoting from the Old Testament. But the rest of that is his inspired comment in the New Testament. But the base command is to honor your father and your mother. That's the main thing. That's the command. The rest of this we'll talk about as we go through this study. Now, in this commandment, we have a transition in the Ten Commandments. If you've been with us in our studies, you know that we've talked about they were written on two tables of stone by the very finger of God. And many people have divided these commandments. They said that on the first table of stone, they all relate to God. They're all Godward. And the second table of stone begins with verse 5. And the last 6 of these commandments are all manward. Now, that's the primary focus. Now, of course, they all have to do with our relationship with God. But in these last 6, numbers 5 through 10, what we call the second table of stone or the second table of commandments specifically tell us how a right relationship with God is going to work out in our relationship with other people and in society. So the first commandment in this second table of commandments is honor your father and your mother. Now, there's a lot of questions that come to mind when you read and study the Bible, but the first question that comes to my mind about this commandment is, why was it the first one on the second table of commandments? Well, there's probably many reasons. But I think one reason is because it's in the home that we first encounter God ordained and God appointed authority. When we're born, we're brought into a world that God has already structured. He's already structured by various spheres of authority, including his authority over all the other authorities in the world. And the first sphere of authority is the home. That's the first sphere of authority that all of us are brought into. It's an introduction, you might say, to every other authority in the world, whether it's the workplace or school or civil government or the church. And so we see that that is the first point that I want to make here. And that is this, that this commandment actually reaches every realm of authority that God has given us. You might say that this commandment right here is a major point in an outline, and then there's a lot of subpoints. But this commandment right here is actually a commandment that reaches to every realm of authority that we'll talk about. Now, I don't have time to talk about all the different authorities that God has authorized. We have civil authority. We're to obey civil government. We have church authority. We are to obey our elders and leaders of the church. And we have parental authorities we're going to see here. We have authority in the workplace, at school, all of these different places. But the most direct and immediate relationship of this command is right here on the surface, and that is the relationship between children and their parents. And that will be the main, actually the only focus of this sermon. I'll make some applications very briefly, but that is the focus of our sermon today. And it's the focus, the main focus right here on the surface in this command. Now, you know, later on, we're going to study other commands, God willing. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. We're going to see that actually they go far beyond just that literal command of don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. And the same is true with honor your father and your mother. There are other areas that this basic command reaches as well. And so we come to this command. It's found in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. And as I said, it's the underlined portion that I have in the slide here that Paul quotes. And I'll read that underlined portion: honor your father and mother. And then he goes on to say that your days may be long upon the good land. That's what Exodus says, that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, he's emphasizing this same commandment, but he's giving it a New Testament fulfillment, as we will see. So Paul, he quotes it, and one of the applications he gives is for small children in obeying their parents. Now, today, that's the only thing I'm going to talk about. But if I do give another lesson on this commandment, I'll talk about the other ways that we honor God, and we'll talk about that just briefly. But the first thing that we see is that when Paul was expounding upon this commandment, he said that children are to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. The duty of small children and children still living at home is to obey their parents. So all messages that we teach, they're all for children, but this is particularly one that is applicable to children, children still living at home. And this is part of what it means to honor your parents. And it's, like I said, going to be the focus of this lesson. Now, to obey is not a complicated word. It's a very simple word. Our children learn this word very early on. Obey means obey. It means to do what your parents tell you to do. And let's notice what he says about this. He says that this is to be done, he said, in the Lord. That's the nature of this obedience. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. You obey your parents as an act of obedience and respect to the Lord. And so you see, this is to be the motivation for obeying your parents, but it's to be the motivation, by the way, of all of us obeying any authority in our lives. But the point is here, as children, your obedience is to be an act of obedience to the Lord himself. And this tells us that true obedience must be from the heart, not grudging, not a resentful obedience. It's not the obedience that you see sometimes, many times with children when they whine and they make ugly faces and they really don't want to do what their parents tell them to do. You should want to do whatever your parents tell you to do as if you were receiving the command directly from Jesus himself. It's not a whining, slinging around, stomping off obedience. You see, even though you do it, you're upset the whole time. That's not true obedience. We are to do it. That's not doing it from the heart, is it? What we are to do is, when we're small children are to obey their parents in the Lord, on the inside, not only when you're, not merely because your parents they are over you. So over and above them, you are obeying the Lord when you do something that your parents tell you to do. And then the second part of this, the next part is, children are to do everything their parents tell them to do. So that's the extent of this obedience. Now you'll notice that God doesn't put a limit to obedience. He doesn't say, children, obey your parents if they tell you to do something that you want to do. Or he doesn't say, children, obey your parents if you feel like what they told you to do is the best thing. No, he simply says, obey your parents at all times and in everything. And this is the proper understanding of what we're saying here in Ephesians is made clear in the parallel passage in Colossians. And I have it quoted there on the screen, where Paul says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Now that's pretty inclusive, isn't it? Obey your parents in everything, not only when you agree and do it in the Lord, do it with the right reason, but you obey them in everything. Now someone might say, really? And you get this a lot. People say, really? We really have to obey them when they tell us anything? Everything they tell us to do, we got to do. What if our parents tell us to do something that's evil, like stealing? Do we have to obey our parents then? Sometimes you'll hear people ask questions like that, and it's a good question. It's legitimate. But let me just say this before I kind of answer that question. Number one, I've been around a lot of people all over the world, and I don't know that I've ever met parents who told their children, hey, I want you to go steal for me, or I want you to, do something that is obviously wrong. They know it's wrong. The children know it's wrong when they do it. I don't know that I can think of any instances like that. I know there are. But what I'm telling you is this: your parents have your best interest in mind. And parents hardly ever tell their children to do something that is a sin. So I don't think, number one, I'm saying that I don't think you have to worry about that. But yes, in answer to your question, the simple biblical answer to your question is, there is one exception when it comes to obeying your parents, and that is if your parent should ever forbid you to do something that God commands you to do, or if your parents should ever ask you to do something that God commands you not to do, you do not have to obey them. You see, in cases like that, what they've done, what your parents have actually done, is they have stepped outside their realm of authority. They have authority given to them by God, but they do not have the authority to tell you to do something that's wrong. And so the same is true with your boss at work. The same is true of the government. The same is true of someone who's a leader in the church. No one who is ordained and recognized by God himself as being an authority figure in your life has the right to tell you to do something that would be a sin. So, but we are to obey our parents. This is the main thing you're to remember. Obey your parents in everything. But of course, everybody's authority is limited. And parents, of course, have to remember something else. There's a verse right after Ephesians 6, verses 1-3, and that is Paul commands in the very next verse by inspiration, parents, don't exasperate your children. You see a lot of parents, their authority has gone to their head and they actually exasperate their children by giving them ridiculous commands. But we're talking about children right now, and you shouldn't worry about those things. You should be concerned about obeying your parents in everything and doing it as if you were doing it to the Lord. And so the next question really is this: is there a time in our lives when this obligation to obey our parents ceases? Well, the answer is yes. And the Bible points out that when a man and woman get married, we're told that they are to leave their father and mother and cleave to their spouse. You see, they're forming a new independent family, a new independent decision-making unit. And at that point, you are no longer obligated to obey your parents in all things. Scripture also indicates that when a man or woman is a widow or divorced, and when someone is no longer dependent upon their parents for the necessities of life, they no longer have to obey their parents. In other words, when they're independent, when they're self-existent adults, even though you might be single like the Apostle Paul was, he was single when he wrote these things, then the command to obey your parents is no longer obligatory. So when you get married or you become a self-supporting adult, then and only then are you no longer required to do what your parents might tell you to do. But up till then, children, up till then, teenagers, up till then, even single college students who are fully dependent upon their parents, your duty is to obey your parents in all things. Now, it's also true that as children get older, wise parents ought to and will give their children more and more independence and freedom in making decisions in many things, because the goal of a wise parent is not that their children always be dependent upon them, but to make them self-sufficient adults. But regardless of your age, if you are dependent upon your parents, it is your duty to obey them. And so next we see Paul gives us the reason that we are to obey our parents. He says, because this is right. So children, young people, why are you to obey your parents? Well, I'll tell you why. Because it's the right thing to do. And why is it the right thing to do? Because God says it's right. That's why. If God says it's right, that's all we need right there. Now, there are other reasons why you ought to obey your parents. Children owe their existence to their parents. Parents are older. Believe it or not, they have a lot more wisdom than you do, because experience brings wisdom in life. And there's a certain wisdom that comes with more experience. And you should obey your parents because no one loves you as a child more than your parents. No one has your best interest at heart more than they do. You see, these are all valid reasons why you should obey your parents. But I'll tell you what, it's not the reason God gives here. The fundamental basic reason for obeying your parents is because God told you to do it. That makes it right in and of itself. And because God declares it to be right to obey them, you don't need any other reason. The ground of obedience to parents is not their personal character. You don't like their personal character. A lot of people have some very bad parents. It's not because psychological studies have proven it's good health for you to obey your parents. No, children obey their parents because it's right. This is God's express will for the parent-child relationship, and we have to trust God. We're doing this, remember, we're doing this for the Lord. We trust Him. We trust He knows what's best. And so we tell children, you obey your parents because He tells you this. And parents need to teach their children when they're very young in this. They need to tell their children, you obey them, but they are to obey you because it's the right thing to do, because God says so. Now, God doesn't have to give us a reason. He's our Father in heaven, right? We prayed earlier, and we called Him our Father. And God gives us many commands. He tells us things to do and tells us things not to do. But sometimes He tells us why He gives those commands. At other times, He doesn't tell us why. And sometimes parents, wise parents, will explain the reason why they give some command or something for them to do. At other times, they don't have to give a reason. And so children, especially when they're younger, they need to know that, hey, you do it because your parents told you to do it. They don't have to explain everything to you for you to understand it. And so we have to trust God that we are doing the right thing as small children when we obey our parents. So anyway, that is what it means to obey, honor our parents. One of the things it means is we obey them. Now, I'm going to talk now about the application for this command. Now, if you're a child still with your parents when you hear this, still dependent upon them, how do you understand this commandment today? Are you giving that kind of obedience to your parents? Would people think when they see you that you are an obedient son or daughter to your parents? You don't grudgingly obey your parents. You don't have a bad attitude. You obey your parents, and you don't have those things. Is that what people would think about you? I want to tell you something. Be on your guard against this common mindset today that parents are out of touch. And don't tell me that's not a common mindset. It is. And I think anybody who knows much knows that it is. And many people, have this attitude. You see it on TV. Parents are, portrayed as being out of touch. Well, that's wrong and that's wicked. But how does God look upon disobedience? Let's just imagine something. Let's imagine you're a child, and let's imagine, or you may be a child, but let's imagine you are a child if you're an adult, or you are a child, and you go next door and you steal something from one of your neighbors, and you get caught. Now, how would you feel? Well, you would feel terrible, and you would be embarrassed. But did you know something? God, He regards defiance to your parents' authority as an even greater sin than stealing from your neighbor. Now, if you go back to the Old Testament, civil law, if they stole something from someone, they had to pay it back ×4. So in other words, if you stole your neighbor's bicycle, you'd have to pay back 4 bicycles, you see. But do you know what God said had to be done to a child who refused to obey their parents? They were to be taken out and put to death. If you stole something, you paid it back 4 times. But if you refused to obey your parents, you were put to death. Look at some of these passages. Exodus 21, verse 15. Whoever strikes his father or mother must be put to death. You just think about that. A boy, let's say, slaps his father or mother in anger in Israel. And you know what happened to them? They were to be taken up and put to death. Look at the next verse. And the one who curses his father or mother shall be put to death. A child doesn't like something, stomps out of the room, utters some curse words on the way out. They curse their father or their mother. And God said, if anybody is heard doing that, cursing their father or mother, they were to be put to death. If you stole your neighbor's bicycle, you paid back 4 bicycles. You curse your father and mother, and God said they're to be put to death. What about the child who does not obey, though? We're talking about obedience, aren't we? What happens? Well, look at Deuteronomy here, 21. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of the town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil among you. All Israel will hear it and be afraid. You see, this was very serious. God is very serious about disobedience to parents. Now listen, it's a very serious and very wicked thing to do, to disrespect and to defy the authority of your parents that God gave them. Do you see what God's teaching? Now, God lists some sins that exemplify in the Bible from time to time this heightened level of depravity that we see in our society. We see it was in the Roman Empire, Greeks, culture, down through history. But God lists these sins from time to time in his word. And the defiance of parental authority is one of those sins. Listen to what Jesus says here in a couple of passages. Here's a passage that you say, well, that's just the Old Testament, put them to death if they don't obey their parents. Listen what Jesus did. This is what he said. Why do you break the commandments of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. Now, does Jesus continue here by saying, now, but that we don't, I don't condone that today. No, Jesus said, but you say, he contrasts what God says to what they were doing and saying. But you say, if anyone declares what might have been used to help their father and mother is devoted to God, they are not to honor their father and mother with it. Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. Now, those were civil laws. I understand that in the Old Testament. But Jesus condoned those civil laws. They were laws of God, weren't they? And God and Jesus are one. Jesus didn't contradict what God said, and he didn't say someone should not be put to death. He contrasted what God taught about disobeying parents with what the Pharisees were doing by not honoring their parents and respecting them. And we see this as well in the teachings of Paul as well. We see this in 2 Timothy, for example, in chapter 4, verse 2. Paul says people in the last days, they're going to be lovers of themselves. Well, we see a lot of that, don't we? Lovers of money, we see even more of that. Boastful, we see lots of that. Proud, abusive, and look at the next thing in Paul's list. Disobedient parents. And he says, and then he mentions a few others, and he says, have nothing to do with such people. I want to tell you something. These are bad lists to be a part of. And children who are disobedient to their parents are part of these lists. Look at what he says in Romans. He said, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they would do things that ought not to be done. He says, a lot of people are depraved, aren't they? God is angry. He actually gives them over to these things. He says, they've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. Now that's a bad list. How many different ways can you say wicked or evil, greed, depraved? He says they're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but approve of those who practice them. It's not just in the Old Testament. God is very serious about disobedience to parents. He ranks it right up there with the worst sins ever. And that's a bad list to be a part of. So disobedience to parents marks a very advanced state of wickedness, according to God. Now, children, I want to warn you today, never allow a spirit of defiance toward your parents to take root in your heart. Disobedience to parents is a very great and wicked sin. It's a sin that will bring God's wrath down upon you. God turns people over. When he's real angry with people, he turns them over sometimes to the sins that they're committing. And God's wrath will come down upon you unless there's repentance and cleansing by the blood of Christ. But don't ever let it take root in your heart. So, as I said earlier, as with all the 10 commandments, they reach far beyond the surface command or the literal words of the command. Maybe in my next lesson on this passage, when I talk about what it means to honor your parents, because you see, as I pointed out, once you become an adult and get married and become independent, you're no longer obligated to obey your parents, but you're always obligated to honor your parents. And that's just another lesson that I'm not going to cover today. But you're going to see as we continue to go through the 10 commandments, the prohibition to murder and adultery and stealing and so on go far beyond that initial, the literal words of that base idea of the command. And so the same is true of this 5th commandment. God teaches us it's an egregious evil to obey parents. And it's an egregious evil to strike your parents or to curse your parents or to slander your parents, to disrespect your parents. And the same is true regarding others in authority. You see, just as God recognizes parents as having authority over their children, and when they command us to do something, we are to do it unless it is a sin. So it is true of, let's say, civil leaders. Now, let's say, for example, a city is having a parade. Well, the city makes laws about parades. All these cities do. Those organizing the parade, they have to apply, get a permit for the parade. They have to get permission. And all of this has to be worked out in advance, doesn't it? And then during the parade, people can't park, for example, where they might park at any other time and on any other day. Your neighborhood, your country, no matter what country you live in, by the way, no matter what neighborhood you live in, they all have laws. And churches, sometimes congregations have some different laws they had, to help the congregation. Parents have rules around the house, and these have to be obeyed. If they're in a position of authority over us, and they're not requiring us to disobey God in any way, these commands, these laws have to be obeyed. And if we don't, we're not obeying God. And as I said, I'm not going into these other passages, Romans 13 and so many other passages about, our boss, obeying our bosses, or obeying civil government, or submitting to church authority, leaders in the church. But this command applies to that as well. And be very, very careful what you say about officially ordained leaders in any capacity. Because again, remember what was said about your parents. And remember, God recognizes these people in authority. They've been lawfully selected. So be careful what you say about them. Now, as an elder myself, ordained elder, ordained minister, I can tell you from experience that people many times don't understand why I do or have done things that I've done. But I can tell you that just like children don't have the insight sometimes of why parents would do what they do, a lot of people don't have insight as to why I do what I do. A lot of civil authorities, they're leaders of neighborhoods and nations and states. They have clubs, whatever, organizations. They have to make decisions, and sometimes the leaders have a lot more information, and they either can't share it with you or they won't share it with you. And as a leader, I've come to find that out in my own life as well. People sometimes don't understand why I would do some of the things that I do, that I can't maybe share information. And so that's why it's best just to listen to the elder in the church or whatever. And if he says, this is what we're going to do, we do it, you see. And so we have to be very careful about what we say about people who are ordained leaders. So a lot of times you need to remember, these political figures, when they get into, you read stuff about them and it's just terrible. I read yesterday, just was flipping down, and I see this guy is just starting to be attacked as just some evil, and call him all kinds of names. Well, the reason is, as I'd seen a few days earlier, that people are seeing him as maybe being the next, main leader to run for president. So they're already starting to attack the guy, the other party. You have to be careful, because a lot of things people say about people that's negative isn't even true. And the same thing is true of elders as well. God puts a wall of protection around ordained people. You don't attack a judge, for example. And you have to be careful about attacking an elder in the church as well, or a sheriff or something like that. Those are serious crimes, including, like I said, a leader, an ordained leader in the church. Because when you hear something negative, what you need to ask is, well, did they confront that leader in the church with this sin? Most of the time you'll see they never even confronted them. Because there was no sin committed. And then did they confront the ordained person and the person refused to repent? And then did they take it in front of the church? And if they didn't do all of this, why are you even talking about it? You're the one who's sinning, passing information along like this, and none of that was ever done. And you got to be careful, because I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of slander. That's just a lie. But it also happens to people in authority. Bosses get lied about. Civil leaders get lied about. And parents many times get lied about. And we've seen what God teaches about that in this commandment. So that's our lesson today. And as I said, these lessons are more far-reaching than just the base command itself. And as I said, I haven't even addressed the issue of honoring your parents. You see, all I've talked about is one aspect of honoring your parents that Paul gives us here, and that is one of the ways we honor our parents is when we're small children, we obey them. But honoring our parents is something that we don't do that once we become adults. But all of our lives, we honor our parents. That's something that we never outgrow. So that's our lesson today. And we'll see next week, God willing, if we, or the following week, if we continue in that vein or we go to the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder.